Hello again. Welcome everyone to our summer waiver series on operational waivers. It's good to be back. I hope everyone had a couple of good weeks, and we're really excited for today's presentation as we focus on a very, very important topic here called risk management in our Risky Business episode. We'll go through the slide deck here, and we'll go through a few things just to review. Keep in mind that the audio is going to be through your computer speakers, so make sure that the volume is adjusted appropriately through your computer speakers. At the bottom of the screen, you will notice there is a question and answer pod. That is where you may submit your question to our group and have that question answered either during our webinar or after the webinar, where we will be posting our questions and answers online. Immediately following this presentation portion of our webinar today will be the live Q&A. That is your chance to ask a question direct to an FAA person, myself, live on the air, and hopefully we can get you the answer that you're looking for quickly. One thing to note, that the entire session is being recorded from about 1 minute ago through the end of the webinar series. One thing I want to mention, if there's an interruption in signal or there is a server issue with Adobe Connect, you may see your screen go gray. Adobe will automatically reconnect once it gets established again, and if that happens, just give me a moment, we'll reset, I'll make sure you guys don't miss anything, and we'll move forward from there. So a little bit of a recap of who we are. We are a group that works in the Flight Standards Division of the Federal Aviation Administration. We're responsible for the certification of airmen and ensuring compliance with the Federal Aviation regulations. Specifically here today, you have access to a dedicated team of UAS experts, and we've got a great group of people here in the background that are willing to help out with your questions that you submit in the Q&A pod. So that means we have folks from the Air Traffic Division, we have folks from the Legal Division, Communication Specialists, Waiver Team Specialists, Flight Standard and Airman Certification Specialists, a large group of people who are waiting for you to submit your questions to them so that we can provide the answers for you. And what, of course, we want to do is try to educate you folks on flying safe UAS operations. So how is this going to work? Well, this is episode 2. We just had episode 1 a couple weeks ago on Where is My Waiver, but this is going to be an ongoing digital workshop series here. The benefit is it allows you to get your questions answered directly by FAA UAS experts. So you're going to hear your answers come straight from the source. All of our videos will be posted online on our website, and I'll have that address for you later on after the presentation. So we're starting with the big hot topic, which are waivers. We want to get the information out to you folks to help you ensure you have a successful waiver application. Beyond that, we're going to change gears based on the input we get from you folks in terms of what you want to talk about. Is that airspace? Is that lands? Let us know what you'd like to see in future webinars. We want to remain flexible to address the topics that are affecting you or the topics that you are concerned about. So our objective always is the safety of the national airspace system. That is our primary objective in anything that we do. And we also want, through this waiver series, to clarify our process in the waiver application as they apply to UAS operations. And in the end, we hope it's a very positive experience for you folks, allowing us to have better communications directly with you, the stakeholder out operating UAS in the national airspace system. So today specifically, here's what we want to focus on. We want to talk about risk management and how that ties into your waiver application. By the end of this presentation today, you should have a really good understanding of how important risk management is, not only in your day-to-day operation, but also when you're applying for a waiver. So to do that, we want to make sure you have all the tools you need and the techniques that are available to help you do risk assessments. And of course, we want to answer your questions. So again, one last comment, if you do have a question, please put it into the Q&A pod at the bottom of the screen. It goes to a specialist that is assigned specifically to handle that type of question, or you may ask questions at the end. But nonetheless, if you don't get your question answered today, don't worry. We will get an answer for you, and those questions and answers will be posted online later. So let's get into the topic here. One of the questions I hear a lot when we start talking about risk management in UAS is, why do I need to know this stuff? Why? I just want to go fly my drone. Why do I have to understand hazards and risk assessment and risk matrix and all this type of stuff? Well, I'm going to try to explain it a couple ways. First, we all know that defined by Public Law 11295, unmanned aircraft system are aircraft. And specifically, you're flying that aircraft in the national airspace system. You're sharing that with other manned aircraft. You're sharing that with other unmanned aircraft, but make no mistake about it, you're operating your aircraft in the National Airspace System. Remember, too, that you hold an airman certificate issued by the FAA, which means you're a pilot. That certificate is issued to you based on your successful completion of a test and your knowledge that you demonstrated to the FAA. So you hold an airman certificate by the FAA. So what does that boil down to? Why do you need to know this stuff? Think of it this way. You are a pilot of an aircraft that's operating in the National Airspace System. And I want to read that again because this is a very important point. You are a pilot of an aircraft operating in the National Airspace System. That's why this stuff is so important. But if you need further help in understanding that, in our waiver guidelines, right on our Drone Zone portal, we provide a couple of important points that you need to hear. One is that it's your job as a waiver applicant to provide justification that establishes that you're going to fly safely, that whatever you're proposing to us is going to be conducted safely. That is your responsibility. So we're going to try to help you with that responsibility here today and through the rest of our waiver series. Furthermore, we state simply, we will deny waiver applications that are submitted without hazard identification or risk mitigation strategies. So it's right there. That's a direct quote out of our guidance. So if you are not submitting your waiver application with hazard identification and risk mitigation strategies, it will be denied. And we don't want to do that. We want to help you folks get your waivers through the process successfully. So here's our task. Help. We want to help you improve your risk management skills, thereby increasing your chances of obtaining a certificate of waiver. Again, we want to help you increase your chances of getting a certificate of waiver, and a big key component of that is risk management. So most of the information you're going to see today comes straight out of our risk management handbook. You can see the control number there on the screen. It's FAA-H-8083-2. This book is designed to help all pilots. There's certainly a lot of information in there for manned aircraft pilots, but there are some key concepts in there that apply directly to unmanned aircraft as well. So it's going to really help all pilots understand risk and how to manage that. And the best part of all, it's a free download. So if you look on your screen right now in the bottom left-hand corner, you should be able to see the download link. And one of the download links is the FAA Risk Management Handbook. But if you don't have it there, I'm going to show you where you can get it afterwards here when the presentation wraps up. Here's what the book says when we're talking about risk management, that it's a formalized way of dealing with hazards. It's the process of weighing the potential costs of risks against the benefit of allowing those risks to stand uncontrolled. Now that's a lot of words and it's straight out of a book. So what I really want you guys to understand is this is what it means to you. It means you want to identify the hazards that you may encounter with your drone operation, and then what are you going to do to reduce the risk those hazards pose. That's what we're really getting after, and that's what we really need to see in your waiver application. So a key element to risk decision making, no matter whether it's a waiver application or you're about to go fly a mission this afternoon, is determining if the risk is justified. That's a key element of this. And so what I'm saying here is that if the risk is high and you cannot mitigate that risk, or if the risk is too high, then we don't fly. And that is relative to a waiver application. It's relative to your flight this afternoon. We all know that in business, if a risk is too high, if it's not worth it, then we don't fly. And that's a key takeaway here today. So when we get into risk management, what we're really talking about are two defining elements: hazard and risk. The hazard is the real or perceived condition that you may see or experience as the pilot, something that you encounter out there. So we're going to use this photo a few times in today's presentation to talk about hazards and risk. But you could probably look at that photo right there and say, you know what, there are some real conditions out there that you could encounter as a UAS operator. I can just see that in the photo. The risk is the assessment you make as the remote pilot of those hazard or cumulative hazards facing you. So the hazard is the thing, the risk is the challenge it poses to you and the threat to safety for you. So those are two key elements we want to talk about. So let's get to the first part of it, identifying or recognizing the hazard. This is missing from a lot of waiver applications, so it's important to remember this point here. We need to be able to recognize and identify hazards. So some of the obvious hazards are easy to pick up. You can look at that photo and you might say, hey, Kevin, you know what? There's some power lines up there. That's clearly a hazard. Or the kid on the skateboard's a hazard. That can be easy. What's a little bit more difficult is projecting the progression of that hazard. So yes, there's power lines and that's a hazard, but I'm not going to fly anywhere near them. Great. But what if this happens? Or what if that happens? Trying to project progression into your risk management strategy of, okay, there's the hazard, but now what? What if? And what if? And that part is a little bit more difficult. To compile difficulty on top of that is our ability to recognize hazard really depends on us as an individual. So it depends on our aversion to risk, our education, and I'm not talking about if you have a PhD or a high school diploma, but I'll get into what I mean by education there, and your experience as well. Those are three key elements that affect you as an individual and your ability to identify hazards in your operation. So what do I mean by aversion to risk? Aversion to risk is simply trying to say, are you a risk taker? Are you more prone to take risks in your operation just because that's who you are and that's how you conduct yourself than somebody else who's maybe less prone to take risks? We need to understand where our risk aversion is. If you are prone to taking risks because that's the type of person you are, that's okay as long as you honestly take a look at yourself in that process and say, okay, I know I'm a bit of a risk taker, so I really need to objectively step back and take a look at my proposed operation from a non-risk taker point of view and help me identify the hazards. That's key. You can simply look at maybe your attitude toward the regulations. Do you look at the regulations as this listing of things that you have to do because somebody said you had to do it? Or do you look at the list of regulations and say, okay, that's the minimum level of safety I need to operate for my business? So your aversion to risk plays a key part in hazard identification. Education is another part of that. How well do you know the rules? How well do you know the capabilities of your UAS? Do you know the limitations of your UAS? What will your UAS do or not do? That will also help you determine what could be a potential hazard or not. Or how about the operating environment? Maybe there's an area you're about to go operate in that you've flown 100 times. You know everything about it. You understand all the hazards. You're very familiar with that. Now you're going to go out and do an operation 2 miles away or 2 hours away that you've never flown in, and it's a new area. That could be a potential barrier to hazard identification because you're not familiar with the area. So it's going to require a little bit more effort on your part to go there and identify those hazards prior to operation. Finally, your experience plays a huge part in being able to identify hazards. Now, we all understand you cannot buy experience. You can't read about it in a book. It's simply something acquired over time. And there's a saying out there about experience that experience can be the worst teacher because it gives you the test first and then it provides the lesson. We don't really want to try to operate that way. So we want to do and earn our experience in the most safe manner possible. One of the issues with experience can be that over time, we get into this thing called normalization of deviation. And I'll explain what that means because we all do it. We all have seen it. Let me give the example of the speed limit on a highway. If the speed limit on the highway is 60 miles an hour, do you drive 60 miles an hour? Probably not. Probably most of us would say, yeah, you know what? I do maybe about 5 miles an hour over the speed limit. Okay, well, why do you do that? The law clearly states the speed limit is 60 miles an hour, but we all do about 65. We do about 5 or 10 over, right? Because we know that we're not going to get a ticket. And so that deviation from that rule, the speed limit, becomes normalized. We all drive about 5 over the speed limit because that's just our normal deviation. It's very tough to recognize that in your operation. When you do something over and over and over again, all of a sudden normalization of deviation can creep into your mission and make it difficult for you to identify hazards. So not only do you need to recognize limitations of the UAS that you're operating, but you need to recognize the limitations of your experience as well. So let's take a look at this picture again. I mentioned we'd come back to that. This picture here, let's do an example of hazard identification. Let's look at the obvious ones in there, right? So you can look at the obvious, and I've circled them, and there may be more that you spot there as well based on your experience in education and aversion to risk. But some of the three big ones on there, I said, okay, I'm operating my UAS here. There's a kid on a skateboard. I've got some power lines overhead. Off in the distance, there's some pedestrian traffic on that footpath. Those are some obvious hazards I think we would all be able to identify without too much work. But what about the not so obvious ones in this photo? For example, take a look at that field. Are we expecting any crop dusting traffic to come in? Is this a time of day that we would expect to see that? Is there a helipad nearby that may end up having low helicopter traffic through that area? We don't know. It's not an obvious hazard, but it's something that you'd want to think about based on your experience and knowledge of the area. How about the time of day? And I know I'm making a little bit of an assumption here, but let's assume that that's towards evening. That sun is setting, you're taking the photos, you're shooting the video at that particular time because you want that lighting element for your production or for your marketing company. Sunset could be a hazard to you. It's not exactly obvious, it's not a power line overhead, but it's something you're going to have to contend with at some point. So yeah, absolutely, approaching sunset could be a hazard. So now what do? We identify these hazards, we point out all the things that are concerning to us, and the obvious, the not so obvious. We have to assess the risk, right? After we identify the hazards, the next step is to assess the risk they pose, and the final step then is to provide mitigation strategies. How are you going to reduce that risk? What are you going to do? What is your process, program, or plan to help you mitigate that risk and reduce the risk that it poses? So assessing risk is not quite as simple as it sounds, and here's why. It's certainly not impossible, but it does take some learning and trial and error through the process. Many applicants have never done a risk assessment before, a formal risk assessment. And so we all have this tendency to think, well, I don't need to put that in my waiver application because it's common sense. Of course I'm going to do this, or of course I'm going to do that. So we have a tendency to think that I'm just not going to put that hazard and risk assessment in my application because it's common sense. I mean, who wouldn't do this or who wouldn't do that? That really doesn't work with assessing risk. Remember, we have to identify all the hazards and provide our assessment of risk and mitigation strategies. And when we're doing all this, not only do we want to consider hazards on the ground or risks of things out on the ground that might interfere with our operation, but clearly we want to consider the things air as well. So airborne and ground-based risks are important. Now, I'm about to walk you through a risk assessment matrix. This is not the only tool available for assessing risk. You could probably look up online and find hundreds of different methodologies or processes for assessing risk, but this is the simplest one, I think, and it helps get our point across. So this tool that we're going to go through is the most basic. It doesn't mean that it's poor. It just means that it's very simple to use, and it's a good tool to help get you started. And all it's going to do is compare the likelihood of a particular event happening against the severity of the outcome of if that event did happen, what would happen to me? How severe would it be? So when we look at this risk assessment matrix, on the left-hand side, you're going to see the likelihood. Improbable, remote, occasionally, or probable. And then across the top, you have severity, going from negligible all the way up to catastrophic. In between those categories, you're going to have your risk assessment. And again, you can label this graph any manner you want. Whatever tool you want to use, whatever style works best for you, that's what we want to help you with. So in this particular case, you've got low risk, medium risk, serious risk, and high risk. So if this were my risk assessment matrix for my operation, I might look at this and say, okay, I'm going to fly anytime that the risk is low, medium, and if it's serious, I'm going to do a lot of mitigations along with my strategies. If my risk is high, for example, if the likelihood of something happening is probable and the result would be catastrophic, then I'm not going to fly. I need to be able to reduce my risk in order to fly that mission. Again, one example here, many others to choose from. Work with what you enjoy best. So again, the higher the risk, the more mitigations will be required. As you move from that risk assessment matrix, bottom right-hand corner to the top left-hand corner, the more assessment you're going to need to do, the more mitigations you're going to need to apply to your, let's say, waiver application or operation, because the more complex it's becoming. As always, any pilot, manned or unmanned, we should understand that if the risk is too high, we don't fly. So if it's too high of a risk, we can't mitigate it down, then we don't fly that particular mission. and we need to be able to make those decisions as the remote pilot in command of an aircraft. So let's go through some examples of risk assessment with some of the hazards that we identified earlier. So one of the hazards is pedestrian traffic, right? So that's a footpath. There's some people biking off in the distance. Pedestrian traffic can be unpredictable. They may be coming down that bike path completely unaware of the operation that you have going on. Or simply based on the operation that you're flying, you may draw people into your area of operation. People say, wow, what is that flying in the sky? I want to go check that out. And they have no idea of the rules. They don't understand Part 107. They don't understand ops over people. And they may walk right underneath your drone. That's something that we need to be aware of with just the simple hazard of pedestrian traffic. So we just go through the risk assessment matrix. Let's take a look at how this might plot out. Now, you may plot a different result based on the data I just gave you, but this is for me. This is for my operation, how I view it. So the likelihood, well, let's say it's a popular pathway and that it's usually pretty busy, but I recognize that, and so I'm going to fly during the weekday. I don't want to do this on a Saturday afternoon on a beautiful day in the park because that bike path is going to be full of people. So I'm going to pick a Tuesday night. So I'm going to pick a weekday operation. So the likelihood of me encountering pedestrian traffic, I'm going to say is occasional. Maybe if it were Saturday, I'd say probable. But this time I'm going to say, okay, well, it's a weeknight, but it's a pretty nice night, good sunset. So occasionally I might have to deal with that. So what's the severity? Well, I'm really going to try to keep my UAS off the pathway, off to the side. So it's never directly over anyone. But in addition to that, I'm going to have my flight failure modes programmed to go away from the path. So even if somebody comes down that path and I'm not expecting, I'm going to say the severity of that event to me would be marginal. So that puts me in the medium risk category. I'm still going to provide mitigations. I'm still going to identify this hazard either to my company or to the FAA in my waiver application, but I'll provide sufficient mitigations moving forward. And what do I mean by that? Well, here's some of the things that we can do. Maybe you want to employ 2 visual observers in this scenario. Okay? They can notify you of pedestrian traffic. They may be able to block off the path for you. Maybe you can say, hey, look, I'm going to be shooting in the next 10 minutes. Let's keep everybody stopped on this path just for 10 minutes. That could be a possibility to temporarily block the path. Or as you maybe already have done is you've established escape paths, that's a plural, for deconflicting with pedestrian traffic. Because you might not know, and they may not come from a direction that you expect. And so one escape path might prove to be unavailable if somebody were to come up and it were a surprise to you in your operation. So have multiple escape paths available. Those are some examples of mitigations to help with that particular hazard and risk assessment. Now, again, risk assessment, hazard identification is a very personal individual event. So you may have different options available to you. And that's what's important. You need to provide your risk assessment and your mitigation strategies for that particular event. So let's look at another potential hazard. Now this was one of those ones that maybe was not so obvious, the approaching sunset. Why would that be a hazard? Well, as the sun goes below the horizon or gets close to the horizon, we may have flight visibility issues. It may get darker if it goes behind a cloud sooner than we thought, or if it goes behind a hill sooner than we thought. That could reduce our flight visibility. Also, depending on the temperature and dew point spread, as that sun gets towards the horizon, you may end up with some ground fog. And ground fog has a tendency to sort of sneak up on us. It's kind of, all of a sudden, it just rolls in when we weren't really expecting it. After sunset, we enter a period of civil twilight. Part 107 allows us to operate during civil twilight, with the exception of Alaska. It's got some different rules for classifying civil twilight, with certain lighting requirements that are met. So we know that when the sun sets, there are lighting requirement changes per rule that we need to comply with. And let's say for this example, I don't hold a daylight waiver yet. I'm going to apply for one, I just haven't. So that's something I really have to be aware of in my hazard and risk assessment. So the likelihood of this event happening, I'm going to say probable. I'm going to say there's a very high chance that the sun is going to set. So when we look then at the severity, we can say, well, what happens? Well, the obstacles get a little bit more difficult to see. Based on the lighting I want for my subject that I'm filming or shooting with photos, I may have to change where my UAS is flying. And that may put me into an area that I didn't necessarily plan on being in. But I'm a good UAS pilot. I'm a very conscious, safety conscious remote pilot. So I scouted the area ahead of time. I know where my obstacles are. So even if the sun drops a little bit towards the horizon, I don't think it's going to be that big of an issue. And to kind of hedge my bets to make sure I'm in compliance, I've lighted my UAS appropriately according to Part 107 to operate during civil twilight. So what I'm getting at is I look at this as a marginal safety risk. So although it's probable that the sun is going to set, the actual risk it poses to me based on the severity is at the serious category. Now, again, I'm going to want to include that if I'm adding this as part of a waiver application, include that hazard, risk assessment, and my supporting mitigations to reduce that risk in my waiver application. It is required. So what can we do with mitigations? Well, make sure that the UAS is equipped with lighting, visible for at least 3 statute miles. Now that's per rule for operating during civil twilight. Or we can establish a hard stop time. Say, hey, look, I'm going to really try to get this shot done, but at 10 minutes prior to official twilight starting, so let's say the sun sets at 8:30 at night, at 8:20, we're done flying. Then I don't even have to worry about that sunset risk. It's just a hard stop time. Again, those are mitigations that work for me. When you make your waiver application, particularly if you're talking about a daylight waiver application, you want to incorporate mitigation strategies that work for you. Now, we've talked a lot about hazard identification, risk assessment, mitigation, and things like that. I want to emphasize one more time, if you're not providing hazard identification and risk mitigation strategies in your waiver application, we are stuck with being unable to make a complete safety analysis, and then therefore we'll have to disapprove the waiver application. So go back to some of the very first slides I talked about. Why is this stuff so important? In a waiver application, in particular, it's absolutely critical that you do risk assessment with hazard identification and risk mitigation strategies. We really need to see this stuff from you. And as I said a few times, it's a very individual process. You have to do what works for you and provide mitigation strategies that work for you in your waiver application. So there are some stuff out there to help you. One of the first ones, and you've heard me say this again and again, the Waiver Safety Explanation Guidelines. Remember, it's your responsibility to provide us the information that shows that you understand risks and you're providing mitigations to ensure an acceptable level of safety. It's not our job to guess at what you're going to do. It's your job to really let us know, spell it out as to the hazard, the assessment, and the mitigation strategies you're going to incorporate. So the Waiver Safety Explanation Guidelines are your starting point. They are a great starting point to help you out. There are lists of questions in there to get you thinking about hazard identification, to get you thinking about risk assessment and mitigation. Remember, as you move up that risk assessment matrix, as your operation becomes more complex, you're going to need to provide additional mitigation and assessment and hazard identification strategies in your waiver application. So don't look at the Waiver Safety Explanation Guidelines as the all-inclusive list. As long as I answer these questions, I'm good to go. If you answer all those questions, and you really need to do that in your waiver application, that is your starting point. Beyond that, you need to include whatever is specific for your operation in that waiver application. So the Waiver Safety Explanation Guidelines we keep talking about because they're extremely important, especially when you're getting into complex waivers. So I put up a couple of guiding questions up here on the screen to help you understand what we mean by these guiding questions and helping you do risk assessment. The first one is obviously for something of a daylight waiver. And the question is, how will the remote PIC be able to tell which direction the aircraft is pointing or flying in the dark? That's a real basic question we have outlined in our Waiver Safety Explanation Guidelines for the daylight waiver. As an applicant, we need to look at that question and say, okay, they're asking about how I can figure out which way my US is going in the dark. What are the risks? Well, the risks are I don't know which way it's pointed, or I don't know which way it may be moving, or I don't have any lighting on it that gives me that clear indication visually. So what are my mitigation strategies? That's up to you. What are you going to do to mitigate the hazard of not being able to tell what direction a UAS is posing or a UAS is flying? What risk does that pose to you? Another question, what are you going to do if other people or aircraft are located during your flight? Well, we get this a lot where somebody says, well, if I'm flying and another aircraft comes in, I'm going to land. Or if I see another aircraft or a helicopter, I'm going to land. That's great. But what if you can't? What if you're operating over an area of water? What if you're operating in an area where simply putting the UAS straight down from a vertical flight path is not acceptable to you? It causes more risk than simply moving it away. We need to know, how are you going to do that? So yes, you should land your aircraft. You need to deconflict with the traffic, but how are you going to do that? The how comes from risk management. That how comes from your assessment of the risk and your mitigation strategies that you provide. So probably no surprise here when we look at the top 3 mistakes when we're looking at waiver applications specifically tuned into the risk management topic here today. People are not identifying hazards. They're simply not identifying any hazards in their waiver application. And if they do identify some hazards, they're not providing sufficient mitigations to reduce or lower the risk to an acceptable level. The example of that is, well, if another aircraft comes in, I'm going to land. Okay, but how are you going to do that? What steps are you going to take? Are you going to employ VOs and helping deconflict with the traffic? We need to see that mitigation lowered down. And finally, too many assumptions are made. So when we look at this, people make way too many assumptions of, well, that's just common sense, or of course everybody's going to do that. Remember, we don't know who you are when you apply. We have a name on a piece of paper. So in order to help us understand what your strategies are, you cannot make a lot of assumptions in your waiver application. You really do need to identify all the hazards, assess all the risks, and provide complete mitigations that reduce those risks to an acceptable level. There are plenty of tools out there to help you. That's the good news. The first one we talked about earlier is the Risk Management Handbook. If you don't necessarily want to read the entire handbook, I understand, but focus on chapters 3 and 4. That is what's really going to help you, especially with today's topic. Chapter 3 is identifying hazards and mitigating risk. Chapter 4 is assessing risk. That's really, really good information in that book. We also have Advisory Circular 107-2, and in Appendix A, there's a lot of information in there as well, very specific to UAS operations to help you with risk assessments. We do have our website, the FAA website. It's, again, your one-stop shop for just about everything you need for UAS information and resources, and the website is www.faa.gov/UAS. Also, through the Drone Zone portal, we have our Drone Zone documents, which I've referenced over and over again in this presentation and previous presentations as well. You're going to find the application instructions, the waiver safety explanation guidelines. All that is available to you on faadronezone.faa.gov. Finally, we have our webinar series website up and running. This is where you're going to have access to all of our previously recorded webinars. All the supporting data that we have available during the live webinar or that is referenced will also be on that website for download. We'll be posting our Q&A questions to that website as well. And the link to get there is www.faa.gov/go/waiver. So taking a look at the scheduled events coming up, on July 10th, we talk about Just the Facts, which is a very specific presentation on what data we want to see and what data is important to include in your waiver application. And then we get into a 2-part series on the dark night, which is really what we're trying to say is how you get your daylight waiver application in terms of what should you be doing with your application. We really want to focus on that because that is our most popular waiver request. We're going to move into the good and the bad, the ugly, where we take a look at some examples of waiver applications, what works, what's not working, and a good refresher on everything that you want to do to ensure a successful waiver. And then we move into beyond visual line of sight, and we're going to talk about operating limitations in terms of altitude waivers. And finally, we'll get to operations over people on September 18th.